House Baratheon of Storm's End was one of the most powerful lords in the Seven Kingdoms, and one of the most significant supporters that the Greens had when the Dance of the Dragons actually kicked off. As the Lords Paramount of the Stormlands, the Baratheons controlled a massive swath of the realm, and whoever held Storm's End held enormous military and strategic value for whichever side they backed. Now, the reason House Baratheon ended up on Team Green is actually more nuanced than people give it credit for, because it wasn't purely ideological. It came down to a combination of political maneuvering, personal loyalties, and what the Baratheons stood to gain. The lord at the head of House Baratheon when the dance began was Borros Baratheon, and if you know anything about Borros, you already know the guy was far more concerned with what he was getting out of the deal than which claimant had the stronger legal claim to the Iron Throne. When Lucerys Velaryon arrived at Storm's End as Rhaenyra's messenger, riding Arrax and carrying her appeal for Baratheon support, Borros made it crystal clear he wasn't interested in honoring any old commitments made by his late father, Boromund. Boromund had sworn to support Rhaenyra's succession back when Viserys I formally named her heir, but Borros had zero intention of dying on that particular hill for free. He told Lucerys point blank that his father had made that vow, not him, and that Rhaenyra had sent a boy with nothing to offer. Then Aemon Targaryen showed up, and Aemond didn't come empty-handed. He came with a marriage offer. Aegon II was willing to take one of Borros' daughters as his queen, or make other matrimonial arrangements within the royal family, giving Baratheon a direct bloodline connection to the Iron Throne. Borros wasn't stupid. He took the deal. House Baratheon would back the Greens, and Storm's End would commit the Stormlands to Aegon's cause. What followed from that fateful meeting was one of the most shocking moments of the whole war. Aemond, riding Vhagar, the largest dragon alive at the time, pursued Lucerys and Arrax out into the storm above Shipbreaker Bay. What started as a pursuit turned into a slaughter. Vhagar killed Arrax and killed Lucerys with him, and Aemond, at least according to some accounts, claimed it wasn't entirely intentional, that Vhagar acted on her own instincts once Arrax attacked first. Whatever the truth of it, Lucerys Velaryon was dead, and that single act of violence transformed what might have been a tense political succession crisis into a full-blown war with no going back. Rhaenyra's grief upon learning of her son's death was profound, and Blood and Cheese, the assassination of Jaehaerys, the young son of Aegon II, came shortly after as her informal act of revenge, plunging the realm even deeper into bloodshed. In terms of military contribution, Borros and his Stormlander forces were genuinely significant. The Stormlands could field substantial armies, and their knights were considered some of the finest in Westeros. House Baratheon's eventual participation in the Battle of the Kingsroad was the culmination of that commitment, and it ended in catastrophic defeat when Borros himself was killed at the Second Battle of Tumbleton, and later when the fighting ground him down. Borros Baratheon ultimately died in battle, fighting against the Blacks to the end. His death without a male heir created a succession crisis for House Baratheon that would take years to resolve after the dance finally ended. So, House Baratheon's alignment with the Greens was driven entirely by ambition and pragmatism. They got a marriage alliance and a chance to cement themselves into the royal bloodline. Whether it was worth it, given that the Greens ultimately lost, is the kind of thing the surviving Baratheons were probably still arguing about long after the ashes cooled. If any house can be called the beating heart of Team Green, it's House Hightower. You genuinely cannot separate the Green faction from the Hightowers, because the Hightowers essentially created the Green faction. The whole thing starts with Alicent Hightower, who married King Viserys I, and over decades of careful political maneuvering, built herself into the most influential figure at court outside of the king himself. Her father, Sir Otto Hightower, served as Hand of the King for years, and was one of the principal architects of the Green strategy. These two people, Otto and Alicent, were the ideological and organizational backbone of everything the Greens did. The term Greens itself comes from the famous tourney at King's Landing in 112 AC, where Alicent wore a green dress, while Rhaenyra wore Targaryen red and black. The factions that formed around them took their names from those colors that day, so the Greens are named, in a very literal sense, after Alicent's fashion choice. And House Hightower, which controls the Old Town, the largest city in Westeros, the seat of the Citadel, the home of the Faith of the Seven's most powerful institutions, brought enormous resources, prestige, and manpower to the Green cause. Lord Lionel Strong's death and Otto Hightower's eventual dismissal and reinstatement as Hand created turbulence at court, but throughout the years leading up to the dance, the Hightower's position only hardened. Alicent's children with Viserys, Aegon, Helaena, Aemond, and Daeron were the Green claimants, and House Hightower's entire dynastic future was tied to their success. If Rhaenyra sat the Iron Throne, the Hightower children would be bastardized in the eyes of the court and stripped of all royal status. Alicent would go from Queen Mother to a politically neutered widow. So this wasn't just ideology for the Hightowers. It was survival. When Viserys I died, Otto Hightower and Alicent moved with extraordinary speed. They convened a small council in secret before the king's death was even announced publicly, gathered the Green loyalists, and crowned Aegon II within days. This was a coup executed with remarkable efficiency, and it left Rhaenyra and her supporters completely blindsided. By the time Rhaenyra's allies could even react, Aegon was sitting on the Iron Throne with a crown on his head and a dragon at his back. Oldtown itself, under Lord Hightower, pledged to support the Greens and provided a vital power base in the south. Daeron Targaryen, Aegon II's youngest brother and arguably one of the most genuinely impressive of Alicent's children, was fostered at Oldtown and rode the dragon to Sarion. He proved himself a capable military commander and won the First Battle of Tumbleton for the Greens, a significant victory that kept the Green cause alive at a critical juncture. Daeron was, by most accounts, the best of the Green princes, honorable, skilled, and not given to the cruelty that Aemon displayed or the weakness Aegon showed. But House Hightower's real contribution was institutional. Otto Hightower understood power and politics better than almost anyone in the realm, and he built the networks, the alliances, and the court faction that made the Greens viable. Without the Hightowers, there is no Green faction. There is no organized opposition to Rhaenyra. There's just a disgruntled court and a quiet succession. The Hightowers weaponized that discontent and turned it into a war. The Hightowers paid for it. Daeron died during the dance. The family's political influence never fully recovered to what it had been before the war. But in the history books, House Hightower will always be remembered as the house that made the Dance of the Dragons happen. House Lannister of Casterly Rock, Lords Paramount of the Westerlands and one of the wealthiest and most powerful houses in all of Westeros, aligned itself with Team Green during the Dance of the Dragons. And like most things the Lannisters do, the decision was calculated, strategic, and tied directly to what they stood to gain. The Lord of Casterly Rock at the time was Jason Lannister, and his house's support for Aegon II gave the Greens a significant boost in both gold and manpower from the western regions of the realm. Jason Lannister marched east with the Lannister host to join the fighting relatively early in the dance, and his death in battle against the Riverlords was one of the more significant Green casualties in the field during the early stages of the war. He was killed at the battle by the Lakeshore, fighting forces loyal to the Black Cause, which created an immediate succession issue for the Westerlands. The Lannister armies, however, didn't simply fall apart after Jason died. Command passed and the march continued, though the engagement and integration of Lannister forces into the broader Green military effort was complicated by the chaos of the conflict. What makes the Lannister support for the Greens interesting is how it reflects the broader strategic map of the dance. The Greens controlled the South, the Reach, and the Westerlands largely backed Aegon II, while the Blacks pulled strength from the North, the Vale, and Rhaenyra's personal domain on Dragonstone. This north-south geographical split meant that the Greens, despite losing some early battles, controlled fertile and wealthy land with enormous economic resources. The Lannisters contributed to that picture by ensuring the Westerlands' gold and levies went to Aegon's cause rather than Rhaenyra's. The Lannister fleet also played a role in controlling coastal waters and trade, though the naval dimension of the dance was always secondary to the land and dragon warfare that dominated the conflict. The Lannisters weren't committed to the Greens out of ideological fervor for male succession over female succession the way some other houses were. They were committed because Otto Hightower and the Green faction had made them a better offer and presented a more plausible claim to royal legitimacy in their eyes. The Lannisters have always backed winners, or at least houses they believed would be winners, and in the early stages of the dance, the Greens controlled King's Landing, the throne itself, and several dragons, which made them look like the safe bet. After Jason's death, his younger brother, Sir Tyler Lannister, took command of the Westerlands armies and continued the campaign. The Lannisters' contribution to the Green War effort was sustained across the full duration of the dance, making them one of the more reliable regional pillars of Aegon's cause. even when the broader war was going badly for the Greens. House Strong of Harrenhal presents one of the most complicated and fascinating stories of houses connected to the Dance of the Dragons, because the Strongs weren't simply a green house. They were a house that started deeply intertwined with the Black Cause and then fell apart entirely, with a fallout shaping both factions. The history here matters enormously, because the Strongs are at the center of the most explosive scandal of the pre-war period. Lord Lionel Strong served as Hand of the King under Viserys I and was, by most accounts, a capable and fair administrator. His sons, Sir Harwin Strong and Larys Strong, both had profound effects on the course of history. Harwin Strong, known as Breakbones, was Rhaenyra's sworn shield, and by every indication that history provides, the actual biological father of Rhaenyra's three eldest sons, Jacaerys, Lucerys, and Joffrey. These children were officially presented as Laenor Velaryon's heirs, but anyone with eyes could see they had brown hair and the face of Harwin Strong rather than the silver hair and Valyrian features of their supposed Velaryon father. This was the foundational scandal that the Greens used to delegitimize Rhaenyra's children and argue that her heirs were bastards, not true-born sons capable of inheriting the throne. Harwin and Lionel Strong both died in the fire at Harrenhal, and the man responsible for that fire was Larys Strong, Harwin's own brother, who arranged the deaths of his father and brother as a political service to Queen Alicent. Larys was twisted in every sense of the word, physically with his clubfoot, and morally with his willingness to commit patricide and fratricide for advancement and influence. He became Alicent's master of whisperers and one of the most dangerous men at court, a spider who dealt in secrets the way other men dealt in coin. Larry Strong made himself indispensable to the Green Cause by positioning himself as Alicent's spymaster, the man who knew everything and could arrange anything. He survived the dance itself through sheer cunning and adaptability, switching loyalty with the kind of cold precision that made him impossible to trust and impossible to ignore. He ultimately died after the dance, executed by Aegon III, who despised him. But during the conflict itself, Larys Strong, the last of his house, was firmly embedded in the Green faction, serving as its intelligence arm and shadow dealer. So House Strong's alignment with Team Green is really Larys Strong's alignment. The rest of the family was dead. And Larys backed the Greens not out of principle, but out of opportunity, because Alicent needed him and because his terrible act of murdering his own father and brother had already bound his fate to hers. House Crakehall of Crakehall, seated in the Westerlands and bannerman to House Lannister, was among the western houses that followed their liege lords into the Green Cause during the Dance of the Dragons. Like many of the Westerlands houses, their alignment with Team Green followed naturally from Casterly Rock's commitment to Aegon II, and the Crakehalls provided the kind of reliable military manpower and knightly service that any major war effort depends on from its regional bannermen. The Crakehalls were an old house, one of the oldest in the Westerlands, with a strong martial tradition. Their heraldry, a black and white brindled boar on a bronze field, reflected a house that had been fighting and warring for generations. Bannermen don't often get the same histories written about them as their liege lords, and the Crakehalls are no exception. Their specific battlefield contributions during the dance aren't chronicled in the same granular detail as those of major houses, but their role as part of the larger Westerlands host under Lannister command is consistent with their general positioning throughout this period of Westerosi history. What's worth noting about houses like Crakehall is that they illustrate something important about how the Dance of the Dragons actually worked at a structural level. The conflict wasn't just about dragons and royal claimants fighting each other in the skies. It was about the loyalty structures of Westeros, the web of lord and bannerman, liege and vassal, being pulled apart and forced to choose. When Jason Lannister committed to Aegon II, the Crakehalls followed. When Lannister men marched east toward the Riverlands, Crakehall soldiers marched with them. The system of feudal loyalty meant that a great lord's decision cascaded downward through the hierarchy of houses beneath them, dragging smaller lords into conflicts they might not have chosen on their own. House Crakehall's support for the Greens is, in that sense, emblematic of how regional bloc loyalty functioned during the dance, and why controlling a great lord meant controlling a whole constellation of lesser houses that orbited around them. House Reyne of Castamere, another Westerlands house and bannerman to the Lannisters, similarly aligned with the Green Cause during the Dance of the Dragons, as part of the broader Westerlands' commitment to Aegon II's claim. The Reynes were a proud and powerful family within the Westerlands hierarchy, and their martial capabilities made them a meaningful contributor to the Lannister-led forces that supported the Green Cause. It's worth noting that the Reynes who marched for the Greens during the dance were ancestors of the Reynes who would later, more than a century after the dance, famously rebel against Casterly Rock and be utterly exterminated by Tywin Lannister, an event immortalized in the song, The Rains of Castamere. During the dance itself, however, the Reynes were functioning as loyal bannermen of the Lannisters, their ambition and pride not yet in full collision with their overlords. The Reynes were known as warriors, and their house's culture placed enormous emphasis on martial valor and physical strength. Their participation in the Green War effort would have involved sending levies and knights to fight under the broader Westerland's banner, contributing to the military campaigns that Jason Lannister, and later his successors in command, conducted against the Black forces in the Riverlands and elsewhere. Like the Crakehalls, the Reynes represent the secondary layer of Westeros's power structure, not the great lords who make the headline decisions, but the powerful vassals whose swords and soldiers make those decisions militarily meaningful. In a war that consumed vast numbers of men across nearly every corner of the Seven Kingdoms, the contribution of houses like Reyne was quietly essential. Armies are not made of great lords alone. They are made of knights and levies, of bannermen who follow the banner above theirs, and the Reynes were proud participants in that structure during this period. House Redwyne of the Arbor is one of the most important naval powers in all of Westeros, and their alignment with Team Green during the Dance of the Dragons gave the Green cause a significant advantage on the water. The Redwynes control the Arbor, which sits at the mouth of the Whispering Sound and commands some of the most strategically vital waters in the Reach. Their fleet, the Redwyne fleet, was renowned throughout the realm as one of the finest naval forces in Westeros, and in a war that had a meaningful maritime dimension, particularly given that Rhaenyra's base was the island fortress of Dragonstone, sea power mattered. The Redwynes were bannermen to House Tyrell of Highgarden, and since the Tyrells committed to the Green cause as part of the broader Reach's support for Aegon II, the Redwynes followed their liege lords into the Green faction. Their fleet supported Green naval operations and helped maintain the dominance that the Greens needed in southern waters to protect their supply lines and prevent Black forces from using sea routes effectively. The Arbor's wealth came from its vineyards. Arbor Gold was the most prized wine in the known world, and the Redwynes' economic resources complemented their military value. A house that could fund a war fleet out of its own treasury and man it with experienced sailors was an asset beyond simply its number of swords. The Redwynes understood the sea the way the Lannisters understood gold, and both resources were what the Greens needed. What makes House Redwyne's Green alignment particularly noteworthy is what it represents strategically. The Dance of the Dragons played out in the context of control over Westeros's key geographic and economic nodes: King's Landing, Old Town, Dragonstone, Harrenhal, and the Riverlands as a crossing point. Control of the waters around the Arbor and the shipping lanes of the Whispering Sound was essential for protecting the Reach from naval raids, and for ensuring that Green supply lines from the south remained open. The Redwyne fleet helped guarantee that. House Redwyne came through the dance in reasonable shape compared to some of their allies, which is perhaps a testament to the fact that naval power, while vital, is also somewhat easier to preserve than armies committed to land battles. Their ships could withdraw when conditions turned bad in ways that knights and foot soldiers could not. The Redwynes were pragmatic about war in the way that seafarers tend to be. They understood that a fleet lost is not easily replaced, and they protected their naval assets accordingly. House Bracken of Stonehenge is one of the Riverland's most ancient houses, and their alignment with the Greens during the Dance of the Dragons has to be understood in the context of a rivalry that is older than any of the political divisions the dance created. The Brackens and the Blackwoods have hated each other for so long that their feud predates the Andal invasion. It goes back to the Age of Heroes and involves competing claims of descent from the First Men and old grievances about land, cattle, and blood that no one alive during the dance could fully remember the origins of. But that hatred endured across centuries and drove the two houses into opposing factions during the Civil War. The Blackwoods backed the Blacks, therefore, the Brackens backed the Greens. That's the fundamental logic of it, and while it sounds simplistic, it captures something true about how deeply personal feuds can shape political allegiance. For the Brackens, supporting the cause that their ancient enemies opposed was reason enough to fight, independent of any deeper ideological commitment to male succession over female succession. The dance gave them an opportunity to fight the Blackwoods under the banner of royal loyalty rather than personal vendetta, which gave the whole thing a veneer of legitimacy it might not have had in isolation. Lord Benjicott Blackwood, known later as Bloody Ben, led the Blackwood forces for the Blacks and proved himself an exceptional commander, winning several engagements against Green-aligned Riverlands forces. The fighting between Bracken and Blackwood partisans during the dance was some of the most vicious local warfare in the Riverlands, a region that was already suffering enormous devastation as armies marched back and forth across it in service of distant royal causes. The Riverlands is always the first place to burn in a Westerosi civil war, and the dance was no exception. The region was torn between houses backing different claimants, and the Bracken-Blackwood feud added another layer of local violence on top of the broader conflict. Stonehenge and Raventry Hall, the respective seats of these ancient enemies, sat not far apart in the troubled heart of the Riverlands, and their proximity meant that the fighting between them was immediate, personal, and devastating. House Bracken's commitment to the Greens wasn't just about the ancient feud, though. The Brackens were a proud and ambitious house in their own right, and backing a royal claimant gave them the chance to earn favor from the crown, land, titles, recognition that winning the right side of a civil war could provide. If Aegon II prevailed, and the Greens won, the Brackens could expect to be rewarded for their loyalty at the Blackwood's expense, potentially settling centuries of disputed claims in their favor. The dance ended without a clean green victory. Aegon II died, and the Blacks' claimant, Aegon III, ultimately took the throne, which complicated the post-war situation for all green-aligned houses, including the Brackens. The ancient feud with the Blackwoods, however, was not resolved by the dance's outcome. It persisted long after the last dragon died, and the last battle was fought, a wound in the Riverlands that no treaty and no royal decree could fully close. The Brackens and the Blackwoods would continue to hate each other through Aegon III's reign and beyond, a reminder that some conflicts run deeper than any war, and that the Dance of the Dragons, for all the devastation it caused, could not settle everything it touched. So that's a breakdown of 8 of the most significant houses that aligned with Team Green during the Dance of the Dragons. What's striking when you look at all of them together is how different their reasons for backing Aegon II actually were. The Hightowers were the architects of the Green faction, and had everything to lose if Rhaenyra won. The Baratheons were in it for a marriage alliance. The Lannisters committed because the Greens controlled King's Landing and looked like the stronger bet. The Strongs, specifically Larrys, were in it because murdering his own family had already tied him to Alicent's cause. Houses like Crakehall and Reyne followed their liege lords into the fight because that's how feudal loyalty works. The Redwynes brought their fleet as part of the broader Reach's commitment. And the Brackens fought for the Greens largely because their ancient enemies, the Blackwoods, fought for the Blacks. None of these motivations are particularly pure. None of them are purely about principle or law or the rightness of the succession. They're about power, survival, ambition, and old hatreds, which is exactly what the Dance of the Dragons was always about underneath all its royal ceremony and dragonfire. The Greens framed their cause as the defense of legitimate succession through the male line, but their coalition was held together by the same things that hold every political coalition together: shared interests and shared enemies. And in the end, despite controlling King's Landing, despite having more dragons at the start of the war, despite the military weight of the Reach and Westerlands behind them, the Greens lost. Aegon II died poisoned in his own chair, and the surviving Blacks installed Rhaenyra's son on the throne as Aegon III. Every house that had committed to the Green cause had to reckon with that outcome and find a way to survive in a realm now ruled by the faction they had spent years trying to destroy. Some managed it better than others. That's always the way with civil wars. You pick a side, you fight your war, and then you live, or don't, with the consequences.